All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So we are going to wrap up the last little bit of evidence for evolution today by talking about some anatomical and developmental similarities that we see across species. So when we talk anatomy, we're talking physical structure. And so let's pick up first with this idea of homologous structures. So if you remember your prefixes, right, homo means same. So these are structures that exist in a variety of species that have some similar arrangement in terms of the way the muscle connects, in terms of the bone structure, blood vessel connections, nerves, so on and so forth, as well as undergoing similar embryological development, meaning when they go from first fertilized cell to developing into an embryo, fetus, and then eventually a baby and into an adult, all of that development early on also is very similar. Now, that being said, these homologous structures don't necessarily look identical to each other. It's just that the arrangement of the bones, the muscle, the blood vessels, so on and so forth, are all very much connected in the same ways, nor do they necessarily need to serve the same function in the organism itself. So the example I have here is a flipper in a whale and the forelimb of a horse. Both have similar muscle, bone, and blood vessel connections, nerve connections. They develop similarly in the embryos of those species, but clearly they don't perform, I should say, the same function. Flipper in a whale, they're using it to swim, where the forelimb in a horse is using it to walk around. Classic example that tends to show up with every textbook out there, any test question that asks this. This is the common example. And these are the forelimbs of these particular species. So you've got the human, the cat, the whale, and the bat here. And if you take a look at the different colorations of these bones, you can see that they all are very much in the same orientation, and the muscle and the blood vessels and the nerves that connect to all of these bones in these forelimbs of these organisms would also be very much similarly arranged. That being said, when you look at those bones and you look at the structure in terms of how long they are, how fat they are, so on and so forth, there's definitely clear differences because these guys all use them for different functions, right? So we use our forelimbs to grasp and for motor control and doing all sorts of things with our hands and our arms. Cats are going to use them more to walk around. Whales are going to use them to swim. The bats use them to fly. Um, so the function is not necessarily identical, but the development and the basic underlying anatomy of these structures is very much the same. So this gives us some indication as to the fact that we all, as these different species, must have shared a common ancestor at some point that had the same forelimb structure. And as we moved into different environments, and we started speciating, we started becoming our own individual species, adapting to those environments that we were living in, changes occurred within these different structures. But the underlying foundation of this forelimb came from our common ancestry. Last type of anatomical structure we'll talk about does circle back to true divergent evolution and common ancestry, and these are these things called vestigial structures. So these are underdeveloped or underused features that apparently seem to serve no current function in the organism today, but presumably held some sort of function in our evolutionary past. So the feature is no longer useful, but we assume it must have had some sort of function in the past in our common ancestors. So be careful with this one because it's not just a matter of you use it and so you strengthen it, or you don't use it and you lose it. That's where we fall into Lamarckian evolution. And remember that Lamarck's ideas didn't hold up in terms of uh, being able to adapt yourself. You don't do that, right? It's the whole population that changes. So what we're talking about here is some sort of genetic mutation over time caused that function of that structure to sort of weaken or disappear as a whole. And at that particular point in that organism and that species evolutionary history, it really didn't seem to matter. The function of that structure no longer was of high importance to the survival of that function of that species. And so we're sort of hanging out with these structures that, because they are no longer useful and a mutation occurred somewhere to limit or get rid of the function of that structure, it's not life or death. Okay. So some examples. When we look at things like nicotine membranes in owls and horses, this is an extra basically clear eyelid. Humans no longer have it. We have just a vestigial structure, a little semilunar fold that doesn't actually cover the eyeball. In horses and owls, it serves as an extra layer of protection against dirt and debris and things getting into their eyes and scratching up the tissue there. Somewhere along the way, our ancestors of humans had a mutation that caused that nicotine membrane to no longer form. We just sort of have a little component to it, but it wasn't life or death. It didn't contribute to the reproductive success of that common ancestor. And as a result, we don't have those anymore because they sort of just got weeded out of the population at random. Wings and flightless birds like our ostrich are the same idea. Whales still have pelvic bones. It tells us something about their common ancestry, that they must have existed on land at some point. Limb bones in tiny snakes, same deal. They have these little limb buds, okay, but they clearly don't have legs, but their ancestors must have. And again, all of this ties back to those structures were at one point important as these species evolved into new environments. Mutations occurred that dramatically reduced the function and the structure itself. Will these things ever go away completely? Maybe, maybe not. If it does, it's going to be really kind of random. There's no way to predict it because at this point, those structures aren't beneficial to them, so they're not going to necessarily hang on to them, but they're not hurting them either, and so they won't necessarily just disappear. It's going to kind of be a random mutation that maybe causes it to no longer form, and maybe that becomes common in the population, and maybe it doesn't. A couple of examples in us, we have an appendix, right? For the most part, it's not harmful or beneficial to us, unless, of course, it bursts and then we remove it. But we think it's an evolutionary holdover for digestion of cellulose, which is a lot of harder plant material, and we aren't designed anymore to digest that, but we think it might have been there at that point. As our diet changed, the organ garnered some mutations that caused it to stop functioning, and that just happened to spread through the population. Again, that third eyelid, that nicotine membrane that I mentioned, we had that tiny fold in the inner eye. Some people can still do this. If you can move your ears up and down, you actually still have the possibility to have an extrinsic additional ear muscles. I can't do it, but I know some people can, and that's an evolutionary holdover from pre-hominids, so pre-human, where organisms at that point would have had it very beneficial to be able to move their ears independently of their head. Think about things like cats and dogs. They can do that as a way to adjust their ability to hear things from different angles. And so somewhere in our lineage, that was an important factor. As we evolved, presumably better eyesight and night vision and things like that, that mutation somewhere along the way to lose that extra bit of hearing capability must not have been dramatic in terms of reproductive success. And so some of us can still do it, some of us can't. Wisdom teeth, same deal. Some of us have them, some of us don't. Most of us get them removed because they're not vital to survival given our current diets. Your tailbone, also a vestigial structure, all right, holdover from ancestors that used to have tails. We no longer do. It's no longer a vital reproductive success necessary trait, but we still have that tailbone as a result. Last thing, so we mentioned, especially with those homologous structures, that not only are they similar in terms of structure in adults, but they also share developmental similarities, especially embryonic developmental similarities. So there are a lot of species that when we look at them early on in embryonic development, it's very difficult to tell the difference from one species to the next unless you are very much an expert in doing this. And so there's a whole field of embryonic development, embryonic evolution to look at the differences when things change, when they diverge, why do they diverge, what's the genetic control mechanisms for all of that. So it's kind of interesting and kind of cool. I'll show you a picture in a second of this comparative embryology study between chickens, pigs, and fish. And at one point or another, they all have very similar embryonic components and embryonic structures to them. And we can throw humans in here as well. So while we are in that embryonic stage, we all have tails. Some of us lose it. Ours eventually kind of shortens up and becomes our tailbone. Some of us keep it. We also all have these gill slits. So fish, they ultimately stay as gills, but actually in humans, we adjusted and mutated our genetic material somewhere along the way, and they actually become the bones of our inner ear, which is pretty cool. If you really want to dive into what sort of things we share as embryos that then we see those structures change in adults, let me know. There's a really cool article just looking at everything from your tailbone, your ears, to problems with our sciatic nerve, to hiccups, to why we have issues with our knees, and all of it ties back to a common ancestor that we share with fish.